It's a huge question because the apparent joining together of suffering and joy seems so radically counterintuitive, and I'm sure it did in the ancient world as well, that we'd think of joy as something when suffering has receded for the moment and we have a sort of a breathing space between periods of either depression or sadness or conflict. But in the New Testament, it seems very clear. And of course, for Paul, it goes back to the cross of Jesus, that the sense that on the cross, Jesus actually took all the evil in the world and exhausted it. And that means that then when Christians suffer, they see themselves as part of that same work, that same process, if you like, that Paul says in chapter 8, that we suffer with him that we may also be glorified with him. But it's not just that this is something we've got to put up with and it'll be better later. It's as though suffering for Paul is a sign that one is in fact living in the overlap of the ages. It's the sign that though the world is still rumbling along and doing its worst, we are in fact part of a different movement. And you see this in the book of Acts, where the apostles get beaten by the court in Jerusalem, and they come out and say, hey, we have been privileged. We have actually suffered for the name of Jesus. And this kind of marks them out. This is not just an idea that they've had in their heads that maybe we belong to Jesus in some way. It's almost a concrete evidence that we are part of the vanguard of God's new movement, of God's new world. And the suffering somehow reveals that to them. Now, speaking for myself, I've often thought, I haven't actually suffered much in my life. I've had some serious difficulties to contend with, but by comparison with what an awful lot of people suffer every day in our world, I've had very little of that. And it seems to me that Paul might say, well, maybe that's because you've compromised on something, and that's quite possible. Maybe the whole Western church has compromised, and maybe that's why we're not as joyful as we should be. But it's also true that when you read the testimony of people who have gone through really terrible times as Christians, then one is struck by the joy as well. Some of the Christian fellowships in China or in Africa or in places where a sense that when people are suffering, then somehow the presence of Jesus is specially close to them at that time. And I've had people who've written to me and who've talked to me about experiences that they've had where the suffering and the joy really do go very closely together. And there's a mystery there, but it's a mystery which actually has the sort of stamp of the gospel, I think, firmly upon it.